Welcome to today's Emergency Preparedness webinar. It's sponsored by the National Cooperative Procurement Partners, the Association for Cooperative Procurement. The idea for this series came from a first aid kit. Not the kind of first aid kit with bandages and ointments, but this first aid kit. Through our NCPP Educational Working Group, we reached out across the country to both suppliers and procurement professionals on the topic of emergency preparedness. And those professionals responded with great information and helpful tips that created the before, during, and after segments on emergency preparedness. This first aid kit has been distributed at conferences across the nation, and since its release, it's generated a lot of great follow-up questions and good discussion. In fact, last week I was recently in the FAPO conference in Orlando, Florida, a state that's been hit hard by hurricanes. And those dedicated procurement professionals during a presentation on the first aid kit had great stories to share, including a lot of surprises despite all their pre-planning and training efforts. So this webinar series is made possible by these strategic suppliers and cooperative partners listed here. They have each contributed to make this webinar series, and they've also paid to have the printing of the first aid kit free and available for public procurement professionals. I'm Tammy Rhymes, former purchasing agent for the City of San Diego and Executive Director of NCPP. So today's topic, it's entitled, In the Eye of the Storm, where the only safe ship is leadership, which covers that information during the actual emergency. And we have three great panelists joining us today, as well as a special guest for our new Ask the Expert portion. So let's get started. So we're going to start with the state of Colorado. Kurt DeCapte was the City of Colorado Springs for 30-plus years and was the Procurement Services Manager for his final 7 years. He obtained his CPPB certification in 1992, acquired FEMA certifications in emergency management, and has been a member of the Rocky Mountain Governmental Purchasing Association and NIGP since 1987. He's now retired and working as a procurement consultant and continues to work closely with organizations on public procurement issues and training. Welcome, Kurt.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So the reason we invited Kurt on today, even though he is retired, he handled an extremely big emergency in the area of Colorado Springs when the fires hit that area a few years ago. So when the fires hit your area, when you were procurement manager, and the emergency was unfolding, can you share how your teams were included or not included in emergency communications, and how did that help or hinder your response?
Well, and that's a great question. And, as the fire developed, it started off slowly, obviously, as fires do. It's not going to be huge to begin with. I was the primary EOC, or Emergency Operations Center, procurement professional in there working for the logistics section. And so, that being said, there were so many things to be considered when this did become and had the big outbreak. After about 4 days, we had what we call the firestorm, and it really kind of took over the neighborhood with the evacuations of thousands and thousands of people and not realizing the loss of homes. So what had happened was, me being the primary, I was going to be activated for the EOC. Where the staff and others became critical was I was gone. I mean, I was not able to do the everyday stuff that was needed to be done. So without that particular EOC training that my staff had or other members of the organization, they helped back me up. I mean, it was one of those things where I just couldn't do that.
Right.
And that being said, that kind of support was invaluable at the time. And if there's a lesson learned, I'm going to jump in on this real quick, is that I wish I would have had some of those folks, my other procurement staff members, have some of that training as well. But again, it was incredible to have that support. And I wasn't the only logistics chief. There was another member of the City of Colorado Springs that was the chief. So we shared that time, and having that professionalism from him to be able to balance that was major.
Perfect. So training in the EOC is a big part of that prep when it actually unfolds. So can you share some of the items that your team was responsible for purchasing or coordinating, and were there any surprise purchases that you didn't expect?
This is going to sound really odd, but there were no real surprise purchases.
Okay.
Not for this particular disaster. It was something that we were fairly well planned, and I can talk about some of the contracts that we had in place that
Sure.
maybe didn't cover as much as what we wanted. Water was key. We were having a heat wave that summer. This happened 6 years ago. This was in 2012,
Right.
when this disaster occurred. And so water for all the firefighters that were there on the front line, and we're talking literally thousands of firefighters from around the country. So water was huge, and coming up with those agreements and getting enough, we weren't. And so we had to do some special deals with Costco, which could be, and I'm not going to badmouth Costco because they came through for me, and
Sure.
sitting down with them on the phone and trying to get this open order with them, which they don't typically do. Was a huge accomplishment. So the surprise was the sheer volume of the items that we needed, but contracts were in place, and we had to add some more because of just the immensity of the disaster.
Yeah, and even when I was in FAPO conference and the Florida crowd was talking about the hurricanes, clean drinking water was one of the number one things for that, and I find that in a lot of emergencies, clean drinking water is a huge requirement, and yet it's not typically a contract that you have in place. Most people work through grocery stores or like you did with Costco. So for our listeners out there, this is sort of interactive. On the right-hand side of your panel, you'll see you can ask questions of any of our panelists or throw information as well. And so if any of you currently have a water contract, I was actually approached by some people at FAPO saying, does anyone have a great idea for how to put a water contract in place? So that sounds like that happened in the fires for you as well.
Yeah, it was definitely one of the primary concerns. And heavy equipment was another one, not a surprise, because we had heavy equipment. And in regards to fires, they need to make larger fire lines. And so
Right.
dozers are required because it started in a wildland and then approached we lost over 340 homes and a couple of lives. So it was definitely one that that coordination for the heavy equipment and to have the drivers for that equipment to do those lines and do the fire breaks that were necessary.
Oh, yeah, that is because you can get the equipment there, but you need someone who's actually capable of driving it.
Yeah.
And can do it during an emergency.
Yeah. And, as I'm sure the listeners all know, and I know the other panelists, when it comes to FEMA, you need to make sure you have that spelled out specifically as far as is that with the driver, how much they're getting paid, and also the hourly rate or daily rate for dozers. It needs to be very specific.
Right, right. So one of the issues that's not usually thought about, we always talk about contracts and emergency response, but we don't often talk about how it impacts the employees themselves. So when we're in those EOC training exercises, everyone's calm and we can easily make it to the EOC, and then during the actual exercise, everybody's state of mind is much different than it is in an actual emergency. Can you share the human element at that time and how it affected you and or your staff?
As you said, Tammy, you're absolutely right. The impact you have, or, you do the training, you do the EOC exercises and everything. I won't say smooth sailing because you learn from those.
Sure.
And I think those are important. I can't emphasize enough to anybody that needs to be or can be involved in those, do it, because that is something that will definitely play a big part when a true emergency comes about. The word I use, and I've used it in the past when I've done presentations on this, is that the word I use is chaos.
Yeah.
When the fire started again, it started on a Saturday. Okay, let's just give you a bit of a timeline.
Sure.
And, it grew, and because of the winds and everything, it was kind of creeping towards town, so that's when the evacuations came. Well, it was on a Tuesday afternoon at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon. There were some atmospheric issues. There was a storm coming in, a dry rainstorm, lightning storm, and it caused the winds to shift, and I mean shift badly, and that's when what we called, as I said earlier, the firestorm.
Right.
Well, that's when the chaos began because, you're trained for it, and you're just going, wow, this is real. We don't have, and we're lucky, and I knock on wood as I say this, that many large disasters here. We've been pretty blessed. I mean, we get our blizzards and those last 2 or 3 days when this one lasted 2 or 3 weeks. So the impact it has on staff is not staff, but just the organization and the neighborhoods and the citizens was huge because it was real and so real. And I'm going to tell a story about the day, 2 days or a day after the firestorm. we were going to be doing interviews for a position that needed to be filled. So in between, I said, okay, we got to get this done because it was just a vacancy that needed to be taken care of.
Right.
So we're interviewing a young lady, and she comes in and everything's wonderful, and she sits down. She goes, I apologize for what I'm wearing, and I was like, no, you're fine. I just hope you haven't been impacted by the fire. And she looked at us, and there were 6 of us, myself and a few other people there. And she said, yeah, I was impacted. I lost my home. And
wow.
All of us kind of got goosebumps and looked at her and said, what are you doing here?
Yeah, she showed up for the interview.
Yeah. She goes, I want this job. I want it bad. And it threw a little bit of that human element. Oh, not a little bit. It threw a huge part of the human element in it. Because here was this woman that all she had was the clothes on her back and some stuff in her car, and she was still there. And that being said, there were so many other people within the organization that had lost their homes or, were evacuated and you couldn't get to their stuff, whether it's just, just the everyday stuff that you need. So, yeah, the impact was immense, and it was all around us to the point where, and her name was Johnny McCoy, who we did hire her, and not because of that, not because of sympathy, but,
But still, you've got a person you can depend on.
I could, even though I couldn't hire her right away. It was one of those things like, man, you would be great, because she did have procurement experience in the government. Right. It was awesome, but, it is just the saddest thing to have that around you, and
right.
To have her a part of it later on, it did benefit us as a staff.
Wow. So you have since retired from the city, and we all know that hindsight is always 20/20. So during that time of the fires, or during your role as a procurement manager, is there anything you wish you would have done differently for those who are listening and still in the job?
I wouldn't say done differently, but maybe have done more in a predictable fashion, taking that EOC experience, which you did use it, but it's just the overwhelming sense of information coming at you from so many different parties right. and agencies and getting it done. And so it was a matter of, we had FEMA contracts that were contracts that did work and were supported by FEMA when the audit came along to get reimbursed. But we did intensify those actions and rewriting those contracts for a more smoother reimbursement. And I can tell you, when it came to the vendors, it was one that we had all these contracts set up and we had emergency numbers for them. And we got better at making sure that we had updated information on those, that we had current numbers. It was right. one of those things we thought we were there, and we weren't. But the vendors, there was an empathy and a willingness to work more closely with us if another disaster came. And sadly, if the listeners do or don't know, a year later we had another large fire that lost 500 some odd homes, more lives. We were better prepared for that because of that. So,
right.
We were trained, and we got more training. But that particular disaster and emergency trained us in ways that you cannot even describe or put into words.
Yeah. The contact information is a big one. So that was a great learning lesson as well for me during my own fires. So thank you so much, Kurt, for sharing particularly a personal story with today's audience. So now we are going to move over to the state of Texas, which has seen its share of emergencies over the past few years. And joining us is Shelley Vineyard. She's the former executive director of the Financial Services Operations from Humboldt Independent School District. It's located in the Houston area. And even though she's recently left the district, she's called in to be with us today and share her story. So welcome.
Thank you, Tammy, and thank you to all the listeners. I enjoyed being part of this webinar today.
So being located in Texas, your school district, particularly in the Houston area, your school district is used to experiencing regular storm systems. However, in this particular case, the one we want you to share today is about Hurricane Harvey, and it hit your area with serious impacts. Can you share some of those details and what happened in those initial days of the emergencies?
I sure can. Well, it really was just a devastating impact to our entire community, and one that kind of took us a little bit by surprise. That may sound funny, but, the storm Harvey, when it hit further down on the southern coast of Texas the last weekend of August, we thought we had gotten through the Saturday and Sunday, and we were just having really mostly a rain event, but we were, handling that okay. And then on Sunday the 27th, our community, we all went to bed, and many of our community members were awoken like in the early hours of that Monday morning with having to be rescued from their homes. There was some needed relief to the release of the dam up north in Conroe, and when they released that water at the rapid rate that they did, in addition to all the rain that was still falling, the San Jacinto River and Lake Houston came out of its banks and in a hurry. So
wow.
We just had, those early days of Harvey's impact, we were all just as community members trying to help each other. Our streets became waterways. We were having to launch boats from the Wendy's, that we all, frequent, and in order to go and rescue people from the second stories and off the rooftops of their homes here in our community. So that was very, very devastating, but at the same time, at the school district, we were trying to keep tabs on what was going on with our facilities. And
sure.
So, that the impact here started on the 27th, and we had personnel out helping to the community. We were busing people to shelters. We were helping deliver food. We had our staff members and teachers that are part of the community, helping, taking shifts in shelters to help people, with
right.
meals and clothing and all those things. But then we were also at the same time having to look forward to what was going to be, what we were going to need to be doing for our facilities. And so we were not able to even get into 3 of our facilities that took on water until August 31st. It took that long for the floodwaters to recede.
Wow.
So quite a bit going on during that time.
Well, and that actually leads to my next question, because you had to as part of this, so during the emergency and immediately thereafter, you ended up having to relocate an entire high school. So what were some of those parameters? How many students? What were some of the constraints that you had to address?
Yes, we had to relocate Kingwood High School, which is one of our largest high schools in the district. We have over 2,700 students that attend
wow.
that school, along with 400 or 500 staff members. So one of the challenges was we have another high school in the Kingwood area, but it was too small to take on additional students, and particularly that many students. And so we very quickly had to, as a executive leadership team, come together, and while we're still, some of us dealing with floods in our homes, come together in the evenings and talk about what we can do to help these students. And we ran through various scenarios. Can we, move middle school, like 6th grade, back down to elementaries? Can we, disperse some of the other kids, other grades, into different areas? But the problem was there was no space big enough in Kingwood that wasn't also flooded.
Right.
So the best option after, probably 2 or 3 days of just working through with all of our teachers and staff that were going to be impacted was that we decided that we were going to need to share a high school with another large high school, which was Summer Creek High School. And what that meant was ultimately is that Summer Creek High School students went to school in the morning, and Kingwood High School students went to school in the afternoon, and they kind of took on a more like a college type schedule with a Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and a Tuesday, Thursday class schedule. And that was a challenge in and of itself just because of the logistics. It's a 45-minute drive one way from Kingwood over to that high school. So that impacted not only busing and transportation, but families who were already dealing with a lot of challenges at home and all. But so the logistics of all of that was, key. But again, remember this all kind of the event started on August 28th. That was the day school was supposed to start.
Yeah, school was starting.
For MLIC. Right. So, we had freezers full of food and everything, supplies and everything already. And many of those, of course, got lost at Kingwood High School. Almost all of it did, because we took on 6 feet of water in that high school.
Wow.
And that's a 585,000 square foot building, along with all the sports complex and everything. So all of it was, devastated by the floodwaters.
You were having to run 2 different student bodies on class schedules, plus all their activities, music, sports, all of that stuff. And then, of course, you have those high school seniors who think their senior year is supposed to be spectacular, and now they're all dealing with this as well. That's a lot of logistics to contain.
It is. We had to really rely a lot on our community members and community partners, churches, other community businesses to help us provide space for like all of our student clubs and places for kids to practice sports and to prepare for, band events and fine arts. And so we were just trying to get all of our kids back to as normal as possible to keep on, with their academic, year. And then at the same time, trying to also figure out how are we going to remediate and recover our buildings.
Sure. So with all of these moving parts, how did you track all the expenses for both your internal district budgets as well as ultimate FEMA reimbursement?
What we decided early on to do, our general ledger account codes are somewhat dictated by the Texas Education Agency, but we have a little bit of flexibility with some of the segments. It's a multi-segmented account. And we just set up a sub-object code for Harvey, which was HV, and all of the budgets and all of the tracking for anything that was Harvey related, whether we knew at the time it was going to be covered by insurance or potentially covered by FEMA. Everything was set up with that object code, and that way we could easily pull reports and, keep up with where all of those expenditures were going. So that was something that really helped us out in the long run.
So now that, and eventually the kids got moved back to the original school, and I think graduation just happened for all of them at both high schools. So looking back on this huge year-long project, what are you especially proud of, and is there anything you would have done differently?
Well, my answer for what I'm especially proud of may surprise a few people. I think most people would expect me to say that the fact that we got our kids back into Kingwood High School by March 18th was, knowing that the whole first floor and part of the second floor were flooded was quite an accomplishment. And I'm not discounting that at all. That took a huge team effort and collaboration with a lot of awesome professionals that help our district and everything. That was huge. But I really want to say that I'm most proud of our kids and how they handled everything over this year. They were amazing.
That's cool.
Just the fact that they were, out of their comfort zone, not at home. And Summer Creek High School, they had to make, concessions for what their year was planned to be. But I tell you very quickly, I think our students were very humbled by all of the outpouring of, donations and well wishes from all over the country. This was quite a news event for our area and for the country, and all eyes were on them. But it was just amazing to see how their perspective changed from how this is impacting me to how can I, be the answer to somebody else's prayer, moving forward. And our kids just excelled in all ways. I mean, academically, in sports, fine arts, all the awards and achievements you could ever imagine, and then some. And yet they were just such good citizens, such good friends to each other, and that really is what I'm most proud of, because in the education business, that's what we're looking for, are turning out well-rounded, great citizens and people who really care about each other, and that's really what my biggest takeaway from the event.
Well, that's an awesome testimonial, because that's not what normally makes the news. It's always the teenagers doing something wrong, and here you had a bunch of them doing something right. So it's a major operation to run any high school during normal times, and the fact that your district did that with all those challenges is amazing. So thanks so much, Shelley, for being with us today.
Thank you.
So with our next panelist, we're going to discuss a different kind of emergency. From California, we are joined by Rochelle Lowe, the Chief of Departmental Operations for the County of San Diego, Department of Purchasing and Contracting. Rochelle's career spans more than 20 years in procurement and contracts, including previous positions as a small business liaison officer and the Small Business Program Manager in the federal and commercial market space. Rochelle holds an MBA and BA in Public Administration and a degree and certificate in Purchasing and Materials Management. Thanks, Rochelle, for joining as a panelist today.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
So when most people think of emergencies, their first thoughts are often fire, hurricanes, and other natural disasters. But in your case, for San Diego County, it came in the form of a health epidemic. Can you share what happened and how your team was brought in to address the problem?
Sure. So back in, I'll say early to mid 2017, our public health officer, Dr. Wilma Wooten, was tracking incidents of hepatitis A. And by May, we had 2 deaths that were confirmed associated with it. And very quickly, by August, the numbers of those who were impacted by hepatitis A were increasing, and the deaths had reached a point where our county public health officer, Dr. Wilma Wooten, declared an emergency. And that allowed the county to respond in a more rapid fashion. And the hepatitis A, in this instance, was it was impacting one of our vulnerable populations, homeless individuals. And the Department of Purchasing and Contracting was brought on board, given a seat at, I know Kurt talked earlier about Emergency Operations Center, which purchasing has a part in that, but that's when it's countywide. Fires, floods, but here we had a health emergency. So they set up a departmental operations center through our public health department, and purchasing was invited to the table to be a part of that response effort.
So in part of that response, you're dealing with a unique population of homeless individuals, and so what were some of those challenges, and how did you address them? Because it's not a typical population most people, deal with or have to serve.
Very true. So the first part of it is, we work for the county, the government. Not necessarily unique to homeless individuals, but not everyone believes us when we say, I'm with the county and I'm here to help.
Correct.
So, there's a challenge related to communication of the health risk, establishing trust quickly, and then delivering the vaccine or moving the individual to the hospital. Once the nurses have talked to these individuals, some of them needed to be immediately hospitalized in order to stabilize them. So we had to bring in, we established teams of professionals, 4 to 5 that would go in together, public health department, nurses, a social worker, behavioral health expert, teamed with our public safety officers going into canyons, open spaces, ravines, and riverbeds to talk to these individuals and explain what the health emergency was, talk about hepatitis A and the unsanitary conditions that contribute to the spread of it, and then offer them protection via the hepatitis A vaccine. So our county employees and the contractors that we also brought on board had to be willing, in some cases, to hike into canyons through brush to get to the folks that we needed to help. We also had a challenge related to belongings. So homeless individuals' treasures, possessions, and sometimes pets also had to be considered. Where do we store them? Where do we take an individual's pet so they can come back and get them?
Right.
We had to look at that. We also had to look at interim housing. An individual who's put into the hospital, once they're stabilized and they're well enough and on a medication regime where they can be released from the hospital, where are they going to go? Back to the same conditions that brought them into the hospital.
Oh,
so we had to come up.
Yeah,
we had to come up with an interim housing solution, and we're all faced with homeless and how do we get them into housing, permanent housing. But in this instance, we need immediate interim housing.
So when you're coordinating with a lot of other agencies, because I know, for instance, you're the County of San Diego, but you have multiple cities, including the City of San Diego, within your jurisdiction. How do you go crossing all of those different territories, different politicians, different purchasing offices? How did you coordinate all that and kept track of all the moving responsibilities?
You know, well, you're from San Diego. You know how that can
And so I'd like to know how you did that.
You know, when it came down to this is a public health emergency, it's declared. We have Governor Jerry Brown declaring a state of emergency related to, you know, federal funded supply of the vaccines that we needed. It was inadequate.
Right.
People had to check the egos and the borders, the lines at the door, and get together to figure out how we were going to do that.
Sure.
Fortunately, Dr. Wooten is the public health officer for the county, including the city. So she is the individual, and her office served as the hub for communication with county executives, with the mayor of the city of San Diego and their team of professionals, so that the response could be a coordinated effort.
Right. So through that, she could pull the jurisdiction as far as, it's kind of like when you have the fire marshal. The fire marshal kind of can pull rank on everyone else during an emergency. That's the same way as her position, I would assume, in a health epidemic.
Exactly.
Okay, so at the end of this epidemic, there were some stats that I pulled off that were in the news, and I have them on this next slide. So was there anything really unique that you purchased that kind of fell outside the typical procurement scenario, or something you learned through this process, even despite your, umpteen years in procurement?
So what was really interesting, there were three things that we did procure other than the interim housing. And the nurses, we bought directly. Purchasing had to buy pre-filled syringes of vaccines. Now, I really didn't find it hadn't struck me as there's a difference between pre-filled and then those you see in the syringe and the nurse draws up the medication. But it was very critical that we had these pre-filled syringes because they were traveling in coolers and backpacks and hiking down canyons, and lighting may not have been the best. And so our folks needed to have the pre-measured medication ready to go when the individual said they were willing to be vaccinated. The other, the unsanitary conditions related to how this was transmitting, we needed to put in hand washing stations and porta potties.
Sure.
Not very, not something we would, normally think about, but in order to reduce the transmission, we had to make these available to those who needed it. And the hand washing stations also had trash cans next to them so that those people could wash their hands.
Right.
Soap and water, keeping your hands clean from the matter that transmits. Right. And then also having a place to use a porta potty. We stationed them all across the city of San Diego, and where homeless tended to congregate.
Sure.
So that those were three things that were outside of what we normally would think about purchasing.
Right. Well, you had a unique circumstance, and you're probably getting called by a lot of folks who have some kind of health epidemic, because now you've gone through that process, which is something that most of us will never or haven't yet been faced with. So thanks, Rochelle, for really sharing this unique circumstance.
No problem.
So for those of you listening in who might have come in a little bit late, on the right-hand side, you do have an ability to ask questions of our panelists. And Shelley, I'm going to actually circle back to you because we did have a question come in regarding the school district from David Tran, and he's asking how many total days did your school district, did you have to cancel classes, or when you merged, were they able to make up the days or not cancel any days? Were there lost school days as a result?
There were some lost school days, but, again, school was supposed to start on August the 28th, and so because Kingwood High School was the only campus that we lost, the rest of the district started school on September the 7th. So about a week later, a little over a week later from when they were supposed to begin. And then Summer Creek High School and Kingwood High School started on September 11th. So really, we really got things going very quickly in terms of, the devastation that we were experiencing. But there were some waivers of days that we were able to, most school districts in our area, the Texas Education Agency made some allowances for some of those days, but you still have to, make up your instructional time and things like that. So we had to be kind of creative, all of our counselors, and getting all of those schedules and everything done, particularly for the kids that were sharing the high school, how they could get all of those instructional minutes in and still meet all the requirements of the regular year. So we just had to work a lot with our state officials and in working out a plan that they would agree to, and that made sure that our students were getting all of the education time that they needed.
Right. Well, thanks for answering that. So now we're moving to the last part of this webinar, and it's a new segment that we have added called Ask the Expert. And for today's webinar, that expert is Norma Houston from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Prior to joining the School of Government in 2006, her previous roles included Chief of Staff and General Counsel to the State Senate President Pro Temp, working for the UNC President's Office, serving as Dare County Attorney, Assistant Attorney General in the North Carolina Department of Justice, and Staff Attorney for the North Carolina Prisoners Legal Services. Houston is often on the front lines with North Carolina public officials during hurricanes because she's an expert on the laws and authority related to emergency management, such as state of emergency declarations. She works closely with the North Carolina Division of Emergency Management and is an expert in local government law and procurement. And in the wake of Hurricane Matthew, she has been helping local governments navigate federal procurement regulations around FEMA reimbursements. And I personally saw Norma speak at a conference in North Carolina, and I was impressed. I took about 5 pages of notes for myself. She's an amazing instructor. So thanks, Norma, so much for sharing your time and talents with our audience today.
And thanks for having me, Tammy. I appreciate it.
So Norma, in your field that deals a lot with legislative requirements, can you share what procurement professionals need to keep front of mind when they're in the middle of dealing with an emergency?
Absolutely. I'm going to offer some recommendations that I've learned not only through my work, but also other experts have taught me that I like to remind procurement officers of in dealing with the context of a disaster or an emergency situation. First and foremost, because you are procurement officers, your job is to know bidding laws, be familiar with FEMA bidding requirements and uniform guidance bidding requirements, and to the extent that you're able to pre-position contracts, very typically done, for example, with debris monitoring and debris removal and disposal, pre-position those contracts in ways that are bid competitively and consistent with FEMA requirements so you don't have to worry about it after the fact. Having template contracts available and ready to go so that you can let them quickly instead of having to scramble around for documents in the midst of a major event. Working with your local emergency management coordinator to identify needs to the extent that you can pre-position or even anticipate what some of those needs might be. I appreciate Kurt's shout out on NIMS training, becoming at least your basic ICS level of training is really helpful so that you understand the emergency management system. And finally, knowing how your state's EM system operates when it's activated. And so, for example, here in North Carolina, we use the Web EOC system, which is pretty common around the country, where the local governments request resources and assets during the time of a storm. And oftentimes you can save yourself the trouble and expense and effort of having to go out and directly procure needed supplies, equipment, personnel, or letting construction contracts on the fly if you're able to get those resources through the state system. So those are some of the recommendations that I like to offer folks, and I'll conclude with a shout out for FEMA's PDAT team. If you're not familiar with FEMA's PDAT team, which is their Procurement Disaster Assistance Team. There's a group of lawyers that FEMA has set up, and they set up a couple of years ago, whose mission is to provide assistance with procurement requirements under FEMA guidelines so that you can avoid losing those funds or dealing with issues of closeout audits or deobligation of funds. And the FEMA's PDAT website has really good training modules on these federal procurement requirements. And an easy way to access that is simply to Google FEMA, F-E-M-A, PDAT, P as in Peter, D as in dog, A as in apple, T as in tango. And you'll come to the PDAT website, and there are online training modules there that really do a good job of walking through those procurement requirements. So becoming familiar with those, I think, is another good practice to engage in.
That's awesome. Thanks for sharing that. So to get in sort of the legal aspects of it, what is the significance when a declaration for state of emergency is declared? So if one is declared for the state, do local jurisdictions, say counties, school districts, or cities, also have to declare one too?
Typically, the answer is yes, and I'm going to say that categorically with a great big caveat. Since I am a lawyer,
Sure.
We like to caveat our advice.
It always depends. That's what my lawyer would always. It depends.
It always, yes, of course, it always depends. And since this is a national audience,
sure.
I'll say that state law is going to vary from state to state. But what the most common scenario is that local governments, and typically that means just cities and counties. And so, for example, in North Carolina, school boards do not have the legal authority to issue a state of emergency declaration.
Oh, okay.
So it's just cities and counties. And so first, if you're working for a unit of local government, helpful to know whether your unit even has the authority to issue a declaration. And if so, does your state law require the locals to issue, or is that your typical statewide emergency operations practice? So typically the answer is going to be yes from a legal standpoint, but I would recommend checking state law. I'll also say that FEMA typically, when you go through your public assistance process, seeking your reimbursement, filling out your project worksheets, going through your kickoff meetings, et cetera, pretty early in the process, someone is going to ask you for your local declaration. And it's helpful to have that, even if the state has declared. And so, for an example, in North Carolina, that obligation is triggered for the city or the county, irrespective of what the governor has declared. And it can be useful, for example, in terms of FEMA reimbursement, in marking the point in time when you started to incur Category B expenses, your emergency response expenses, for reimbursement purposes. And also in our state, as is typical across the country, the issuance of a local state of emergency declaration then triggers the legal authority for the local government to impose restrictions and prohibitions to deal with the emergency. So, for example, ordering evacuations, imposing curfews, limited reentry, closing down businesses, et cetera. Typically, the legal authority to do that is triggered when a local state of emergency is declared.
Okay. So it's specific to the state, to the agency. So it's something that people have to check out for themselves then.
Yes, although it's pretty common across the country for cities and counties to have that authority and to be required to exercise it irrespective of gubernatorial action, definitely check your own state law.
Okay, perfect. So when I was watching your presentation in North Carolina, you have created so many great resources for them. And one of those that I was really impressed with was what you call the crosswalk. And in an emergency, procurement teams have to know when to apply federal guidelines versus their own procurement rules. And then you had different versions, different types of crosswalks, depending on the scenario or what type of service, whether it was construction, commodities, or some kind of consulting services. So here is one of your versions of one of those crosswalks. Can you share how it works and then how others might want to take the next steps to create a version for their own jurisdiction?
Sure, excuse me, and thank you for the compliment. This is what we do at the School of Government here, the unit at UNC Chapel Hill, Go Tar Heels, if we have any Tar Heels fans listening on the line, that we do. And our mission at the School of Government is to serve state and local government officials in the state. And so I work, all of my teaching and the resources I developed are geared towards helping local governments and state officials in our state do their jobs. So what you see on the screen is an example of the types of materials that we at the School of Government generate. And this one demonstrates the various procurement methods authorized under the Uniform Guidance, which are the set of federal rules that are applicable to FEMA public assistance reimbursement funds. And so this demonstrates the levels, the bid thresholds, and the procurement procedure that is triggered at those bid thresholds. and I have a similar slide that looks the same in terms of the arrow charts that shows how this looks under state law, and then another slide that compares and contrasts the two.
Right. So working through this,
side by side, yeah.
Yeah, so working through this and just reading it. So so you've got three different arrows going up. So the first is purchasing a service or I would assume that's a commodity as well.
Right. Well, it's a purchase contract, so buying a commodity, buying personal property, apparatus, supplies, materials, equipment, stuff, or a service contract.
Okay.
So, for example, in the world of FEMA, so those are really that's representative of two different categories of contracts. So in the typical world of disaster, a common service contract is debris removal. So debris removal or debris monitoring.
Security services.
So,
yeah, something like that.
Security services, exactly right. Yep, exactly
so
right.
Could the way leases as
well.
Mm-hmm. So just to walk through this, so if we start at the bottom line, up to $3,500, that's considered a micro purchase. And pretty much you can go out and get it however you need to, whether it's a P card, do you have to have quotes at that point?
No, you do not. You're not required to engage in any sort of competition in the gold bar, below the micro purchase threshold. When you hit 3,500, that's the micro purchase threshold that's set currently under the FAR.
So let me ask you this, and I'm just put my purchasing habit on. So if I'm sitting there and I need to buy 15 pallets of bottled water, and it happens to fall under the 3,500, and I go ahead and purchase it like Kurt did from Costco. Now, 2 weeks down the road, I need more pallets of that same water. Is it cumulative or is it per purchase?
It is per transaction.
Okay, per transaction.
Per purchase, per contract, for example, because each of those transactions is going to be a separate contract. I would be careful, though, not to stretch that interpretation too far so that you end up expending tens and hundreds of thousands of dollars with the same vendor without being to demonstrate and then having to justify why you've done so without some sort of procurement.
Right. No, I totally agree. And sometimes you don't know until 2 weeks later you figure out you needed some more. But so now let's go up to the purple. Explain what that means. Up to the 150,000.
Right. Purple is the small purchase method under the uniform guidance. And so that is similar to what many states would call their informal bidding procedures. So you are required to solicit quotes, but you don't have rigid advertising requirements. You don't have formal advertising requirements. Bids don't have to be received sealed. So a relatively informal process, but there is competition involved. Okay.
And then as you go above the 150,000, then we need to get formal.
Correct. And above 150,000, 150 is a simplified acquisition threshold set in the FAR. There are, for purchase and service contracts as well as construction contracts, there are two options. The primary, sort of the default, if you want to think about it this way, is the sealed bid method, which is your traditional hard bid, lowest responsible bidder method of bidding. And as the federal rules provide, if the conditions are not appropriate for sealed bidding, so perhaps it's a consulting contract where you'd like to have evaluation criteria and look at qualifications and experience as opposed to a low-cost bid, then you can, if those conditions warrant, then you can use what the uniform guidance calls the competitive proposals methods, which is basically a competitive RFP process.
Right.
And hiring architects and engineers, it's basically the same. The small purchase, you can look at qualifications, and then certainly when you hit 150 and above, you are looking at what you would think of under federal law as the Brooks Act. You're using a qualifications-based selection process in hiring those AE services.
Yeah, and from what I understand, Mike Martinet was our Ask the Expert on our first webinar. He mentioned, and I just want to reiterate for those who weren't on that one, that when procurement is looking at two sets of criteria, your own and FEMA, you're supposed to choose the more restrictive of the two. Is that correct?
Absolutely. In fact, it's your own, meaning your local policies, your state laws, and FEMA. So, for example, going back to your example of the micro purchase, and you want to go out and use your P card and spend buy $2,000 worth of bottled water pallets. Well, under federal law, you can do that without bidding. Maybe your state threshold is higher than $3,500, so state law doesn't require you to bid. But if you have a local policy that sets a minimum quote requirement at, say, $500 or $1,000, though federal law does not require you to bid it, you're going to have to under your local policy.
Right, right. So you have to take the most restrictive, whichever one that is.
Correct.
And so it might behoove those who are listening in that if you don't have some kind of chart, sometimes it's kind of like that algebra equation. If this, then I go that way. If that, then I go this way, to make it all add up in the end. So I just wanted to show this, and if anybody after this webinar, I hope you don't mind, you provided me a few examples of yours and it applies to the North Carolina, obviously, but I'd be happy to share that with others who are trying to create something for themselves to keep track of all the moving pieces during any emergency, if that's okay.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, I'll give you our School of Government's local government purchasing and contracting web address where we are loading all of our uniform guidance, general resources we've developed, as well as those that are FEMA specific. So, for example, a sample gifts and conflicts policy that you have to have in place in writing under the uniform guidance, the sample procurement policies. Now, again, ours are geared towards a crosswalk of North Carolina law, but if it helps to have a starting point and folks to think about this, you can go to www.ncpurchasing. So that's all together in one word, North Carolina, but ncpurchasing.unc, like UNC the Tar Heels, .edu for education.
Okay.
And on that page, there is a link under resources on the right-hand side of the page that's called tools. If you click on that, that's a page that takes you to a bunch of tools that we've developed for local government purchasers. And at the bottom of that page, you will see federal procurement requirements. If you click on that link, then you will be taken to our federal procurement resources page.
Awesome.
And
Thank you for sharing that.
And great resources, again, and written sample materials on the FEMA PDAT website as well.
That's perfect. Thank you for sharing that. So I've also been on your website, and you have a great blog series, and I really like the one. The one that I read was entitled Mandatory Evacuations. Are they really enforceable? So thinking back to 2007 when we had the fires in San Diego County, my husband and I, we did not evacuate our own home, and I often wondered if I could have been arrested for that. Can you share what a mandatory evacuation means?
Well, I don't know what the law is in California. I believe in Texas, if memory serves me right, Shelley, I think in Texas, first responders have the authority to use force to compel evacuations. Our law doesn't go quite that far in North Carolina, but pretty typically there is some enforcement mechanism. In North Carolina, mandatory evacuation can be enforced with a criminal sanction. It's a misdemeanor offense, so it's not likely somebody would actually be arrested and hauled away in handcuffs. Most emergency managers and first responders will tell you that law enforcement typically has better things to do than to go door-to-door knocking. But now in a case, for example, of the wildfires, and I was thinking about this when Kurt was talking, you might need law enforcement to really take matters seriously, strongly, and encouraging people in strong ways.
Yeah.
If you have a wildfire bearing down quickly, the same might happen in a flash flooding situation.
Sure.
So mandatory means different things across the country depending on particular states' laws. But that terminology can be helpful in resort communities, even if the local government isn't strongly enforcing it, for example, using its arrest powers, but still characterizes it as mandatory for two reasons. One, that really grabs the public's attention, and they're more likely to pay heed and get out of harm's way. And two, if you're in a resort community, oftentimes the use of the term mandatory will trigger renter's insurance for your visitors, for your tourists who have to leave early. And they're able to then recover the cost of their lost expenses, vacation expenses, under their renter's insurance. So oftentimes those renter's insurance policies will pay out when there is a mandatory evacuation.
Right. Wow, that's interesting. I didn't even think of the renter's insurance. Well, thank you, Norma. Gosh, that's a ton of information you provided, and thanks for also providing that website for folks to be able to follow up on some of the additional tools that are available. Appreciate that.
So thank you for including me.
I did have one question come in for you, Rochelle, and it was regarding the vaccines itself. I guess it's somebody that also works with pharmaceutical companies, and they were asking how was that process to work with a large pharmaceutical company during a health emergency and get the vaccine you needed?
It was actually easier to work with the large pharmaceutical than it was to work with where we normally get our pharmacy, our prescriptions filled.
Oh, okay.
They have territorial representatives that generally will work with, say, the McKessons of the world. But because this was a public health emergency, we were able to bypass where we normally go and work directly with the territorial representative, who then smoothed the way with GlaxoSmithKline.
Okay. And you were able to get the number of vaccines you needed? Was it special shipments?
Because it was a declared public emergency, the CDC smoothed our way for us to get be put first in line for those shipments.
Okay, that's interesting, because that's not something most of us order as a routine procurement.
It was different, but everyone really worked together to be able to stop this, because so many people were, the sickness and then dying. Of course, we want to get in front of that.
So I'm going to go back to Norma. We had a question regarding, and actually it's Jennifer, thanks for your question. She said she's heard FEMA doesn't like government agencies to utilize cooperative contracts for purchases for reimbursements. Is that true, or does that depend?
It generally is true, but it also might depend.
Okay.
How's that for it?
Well, give me an example of when they could do it, maybe.
Yes. Generally speaking, and it's not just FEMA, but generally speaking under the uniform guidance, there is no blanket exception to the federal procurement requirements for group purchasing programs or co-op purchases.
Right.
And FEMA certainly holds to that. It's really viewed as a form of piggybacking, which is specifically disallowed under the uniform guidance. Where it might be possible, and Shelley, this actually happened in your neck of the woods down in Texas during your storm. I can't remember which school system it was down there, but one of your school systems, it might even be yours, actually runs its own co-op, its own national co-op. And so it's actually a unit of government running a co-op as opposed to a nonprofit or a for-profit corporation. And they pre-position and bid their contracts actually consistent with federal bidding requirements, which was really, really smart.
Okay.
And so the uniform guidance actually encourages interlocal cooperation, so long as the contracts are bid consistent with federal procurement requirements and the contracts themselves include all of the required contract provisions. There's about a dozen contract provisions that have to be in the contract. So I think FEMA would accept it, and in fact they did in Harvey for those school systems in Texas, where the co-op is actually one that is run by or perhaps has significant involvement by governmental entities, and those contracts are competitively bid consistent with federal requirements. I would still, though, encourage, before you just assume that it's going to be okay, that you check and get confirmation from FEMA or from your state representative, your state division folks in emergency management, that the purchase is going to be allowed. Because we ran into that in Hurricane Harvey here or Hurricane Matthew in North Carolina. About half of our state was under federal declarations after that storm. And we had a number of local governments that were starting to purchase off national contracts, and we put it to a stop because FEMA was specifically not going to allow reimbursement for those co-op purchases.
And I know that's a conversation the cooperative world is having right now, what language needs to be included as they go forward with future bids and see if they can start working within FEMA guidelines as well. So I think they're also taking that to heart on what they need to do on their side. So I want to thank all our panelists and the audience for joining us today. These panelists are professionals who are passionate about procurement, if you haven't heard it in their voices, and they have given their time to share with all of us today, and we all really appreciate it. So when we began this webinar, I mentioned a first aid kit that started this series. So if you're thinking, how do I get a copy of that first aid kit? It's super easy. Just visit the NCPP website to download a copy under the Education tab. And yes, there is more. When you pull down that tab, you'll also see within the text, we have a list of contracts. This list was created by asking procurement professionals, like the panelists involved here, as well as suppliers who respond to emergencies, what contracts do I need to have in place before an emergency? So it's a free resource for you. It's about 5 pages long, but feel free to share with your key customer departments as well. These are contracts or things that you will need to be able to purchase in any type of emergency. Procurement is one of the hardest roles in government. My purchasing job was my best, hardest role in the 24 years I served at the City of San Diego. I thank you for what you do in our profession and your organizations. I'm Tammy Rhymes, and I thank you for joining us today. Thanks again to our panelists. Goodbye.